This video is part 3 to the Building Internal Developer Platforms ebook series. Today we're going to take a look at how to get vCluster running and then how to use some of the integrations and stuff along with vCluster like Argo CD, Vault, and Terraform. Let's go ahead and jump in and get started. We're going to go ahead and get on the command line for some of this stuff too, so go ahead and follow along. If you want to skip ahead, go ahead and download the ebook that's in the description below, and you can go ahead and see what we're going to do here and then see what's coming up in the next couple of videos. So I'm going to try to knock out 2 chapters at a time for the next couple of videos. That way we should have about 3 more videos left to go. But if you have any other questions or need to know more, let us know. Let's get started. Okay, setting up your vCluster environment. We're going to go over prerequisites for setting up vCluster, installing vCluster, configuring your virtual cluster, and then best practices for vCluster management. So some of the prerequisites for setting up vCluster are a Kubernetes cluster. So all this runs on Kubernetes, so you're going to need a Kubernetes cluster. kubectl, so to interact with Kubernetes, you're going to need a command line tool. One of the helpful things you can do is alias k equals kubectl, so you can just do kget whatever, instead of actually having to type out kubectl for everything. And then you're gonna need Helm. Helm is needed to deploy some components of vCluster, and it's all around useful if you're using Kubernetes. And then the vCluster CLI. So this command line tool is used to create, manage, and delete virtual clusters. So let's go ahead and install vCluster. So once the prerequisites are met, the next step is to create your first virtual cluster. So let's go ahead and head to the command line. All right, now that we're on the command line, let's go ahead and get vCluster installed. So first we're gonna do brew install loft-sh/tap/vCluster to install the vCluster CLI. And then once that's finished and installed, what we're going to do is create a virtual cluster. So we're already connected to a Kubernetes cluster. We have a kube config. We can access a Kubernetes cluster. What we'll do next is type out vCluster, create my vCluster -n for namespace, my vCluster namespace. And what this is going to do is deploy the vCluster into the namespace, my -vCluster -namespace. So it'll take about a minute. And then once it's up, what we can do is it'll automatically connect. But what we're going to do is disconnect. And then we're going to show you the connect command so that you can connect later if you're not using something like Ingress or something like that to expose it. And then once we connect, what we can do is we can take a look at the namespaces that are actually in that virtual cluster and compare that to what's running on the host cluster. All right, so once it's up, what we'll do is go ahead and type out vCluster connect my-vCluster -n for namespace, my-vCluster -namespace. And now that we're connected, what we can do is open up another tab in terminal, and we can check out what namespaces are in our new virtual cluster. So now our context is actually the new virtual cluster, and it's not the host cluster anymore. So let's go ahead and disconnect from the vCluster, and what we'll do is make sure that our context is the correct one. What we'll do is we'll type kubectl getns, and now we can see the namespaces that are running on the host cluster and how they differ from what's running in the virtual cluster. Now that we've got that set up, let's go and talk about configuring your virtual cluster. So you can use network policies. Basically, you can define network policies to control traffic flow between pods within your virtual cluster to enhance security. You can use persistent storage. So if your applications require persistent storage, you're going to need to configure it and set up a storage class. Resource limits. So limits and quotas are a great way to manage how many resources a virtual cluster has access to and can use. So definitely set these up if you need to set limits for your users and you don't want them overusing and you want to make sure that your virtual cluster stays small, or if you want to give them a lot of access, you can go ahead and set these limits pretty high and let them grow out a pretty large vCluster, right? But usually you're probably going to limit them a little bit so that these things aren't getting way too big. So some of the best practices for vCluster management are regular updates. So make sure you update the virtual cluster regularly. Subscribe to the roadmap to get updates. That way you know what's coming with the new versions. Basically, here's the URL for that, roadmap.vcluster.com/changelog. This will give you an idea of what's coming, what's changing, all the new stuff that comes along with the updated versions of vCluster, and it's the best place to follow along. Monitoring and logging. Implement monitoring and logging to keep track of performance, inform quotas, limits, and view the health of your virtual clusters. And then you want to do some security hardening, right? So use security best practices such as role-based access controls, RBAC, secret management, and compliance checks to safeguard your environment. So basically, everything you're already doing with Kubernetes, you want to go ahead and you can apply it to vCluster too. Everything's running on the base cluster, so you can use a lot of the built-in feature sets of Kubernetes to manage these things and to monitor and log everything. And now what we're going to do is go and hop into chapter 4, which is integrating essential DevOps tools with vCluster. So we're looking at integrating Argo CD, integrating Vault by HashiCorp, integrating Terraform, and then the conclusion for these 2 chapters. So integrating Argo CD. So Argo CD is a declarative GitOps tool that automates the deployment of applications in Kubernetes. You can use Argo CD to manage deployments within Kubernetes by configuring it to track a repository where your Kubernetes configurations and Helm charts are stored. So basically, Argo CD is a great way to deploy virtual clusters. You can just set this up as an application and it'll deploy it for you. But let's go ahead and hop to the command line and get Argo CD installed and take a look real quick. Now that we're on the command line, let's check out what we can do for Argo CD. So let's go ahead and start out with vCluster list. This is going to show the virtual cluster that's currently running. And then what we want to do is type out vCluster connect my-vCluster -n for namespace, my-vCluster -namespace. And then we're going to send it kubectl apply-f with the Argo CD install manifest. And this is going to install Argo CD into this virtual cluster. And then once it's installed, what we can do is we can type kubectl port forward service-argo CD server -n for the namespace Argo CD. and port forward 8080 to port 443 there so that we can open it up in a browser and we can take a look at Argo. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and open up a browser and let's take a look and see Argo CD running. And this is running in our virtual cluster. There it is. Everything seems to be working. Let's go ahead and hop back to the slides. All right, now that we've done that, let's go ahead and look at integrating Vault by HashiCorp. So HashiCorp Vault secures, stores, and tightly controls access to tokens, passwords, API keys, and other secrets. In a Kubernetes environment, Vault can manage secrets and protect sensitive information. Let's go to the command line here again and take a look at how to get Vault installed. We're not going to get too deep into it because to configure it, you're actually going to need to go over to the Vault information and follow the official docs. Okay, now what we're going to do is take a quick look at installing Vault. So what we need to do first is add the Helm repo. So you can do Helm repo add HashiCorp and then the URL for the repository. And then what we'll do is we'll install Vault with Helm install Vault HashiCorp/Vault - set server.dev.enabled equals true, and we're going to tell it which namespace to install in, which is the same namespace that we're installing our vCluster in. To get more information about installing this, you're going to need to head to the Vault documentation, and then you can go and get started past that. This is just a quick example of how you can install Vault based on the ebook. All right, now that we've got that installed, let's look at integrating Terraform. So Terraform by HashiCorp enables teams to define and provision infrastructure using a declarative configuration language. In a vCluster environment, Terraform can be used to manage both Kubernetes resources and external dependencies. So for setup and configuration, you're going to define the infrastructure. So you're going to create a Terraform configuration file that specifies your Kubernetes resources, such as deployment, services, and entire environment. Use a Terraform workflow of init, plan, and apply to go ahead and get these configured, and then use Terraform to update or modify your infrastructure as requirements change, ensuring your virtual clusters remain aligned with your configurations. So we have documentation on how to set this all up. I'll put the documentation link in the description below too. There you can actually follow along and see what a Terraform configuration file is actually going to look like and how you can get stuff set up. We also have some examples too if you want to get a little bit deeper, and we've got a video on how to use Terraform. So the conclusion for this video. So in this video, we covered installing the vCluster CLI, creating a vCluster, integrating Argo CD, integrating Vault, and then using Terraform. In the next video, we're going to cover empowering developers with vCluster and advanced topics in managing virtual Kubernetes clusters. So thank you for watching this video. If you want to get ahead, you can go ahead and download the ebook. The information's in the description below. If you have any comments or questions, let us know, post them below, and I'll take a look and try to answer them. Join Slack if you have other questions about our other projects like DevPod, or if you just want to ask something about vCluster, if you're running into issues, we're on there, we can help out. And we'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.